Hello, and welcome to another episode of AI in the Classroom Daily, a podcast helping educators make sense of AI without the hype. I'm Dan Cogan-Drew, and I use AI as a thinking partner in preparing each of these episodes because I think the best way to talk honestly about AI in education is to work with it openly. So there's a lot of noise right now about technology in schools, even more noise than usual, you might say. And I mean that almost literally. It's very loud, it's overlapping, it's coming from multiple directions at once. It's a little bit hard to make sense of. In some state legislatures, there are bills moving to ban not just cell phones, but school-issued devices more broadly, Chromebooks, laptops, tablets. And at the same time, schools are being urged by vendors, of course, by consultants, of course, by a good portion of the EdTech press to embrace AI as a transformative tool. And underneath both of these conversations, a neuroscientist named Jared Cooney-Horvath has become something of a viral figure, testifying before a U.S. Senate committee with a claim that's simple, stark, and spreading fast. When tech enters education, learning goes down. His Senate testimony has been viewed over 2 million times on C-SPAN's YouTube page. Clipped versions are circulating on Instagram. Parents are showing up to school board meetings with copies of his self-published book. And some states are moving to act. Chalkbeat's Matt Barnum did something useful in response to all of this. He took a careful look at the actual evidence behind Horvath's case, and his conclusion: there is no smoking gun data showing that EdTech is causing recent learning declines. But that doesn't mean that the argument should be dismissed. So before I go further, let me disclose a few things. One, Horvath runs an education consulting company. His book is being re-released by a major publisher this summer. It doesn't make his argument wrong, but it's relevant context for evaluating testimony delivered to the U.S. Senate. Second, the Chalkbeat piece sits in a new section they're calling Chalkbeat Ideas, which is a kind of reported opinion. It's responsible journalism, to be clear. I'd recommend reading it, but it's not a neutral news report. And the piece that I'm going to refer to from Education Week is an opinion Q&A between two reform-aligned voices, Rick Hess from the American Enterprise Institute and Michael Horn from the Christensen Institute. It's worth knowing who is in the room and the voices we're listening to. I'll also note that I'm the co-founder of Newsella, which is a venture-backed EdTech company, so I clearly have skin in this game, and you should be aware of that as you listen to me. So what is Horvath actually arguing? Well, three things. First, he notes a correlation between international test scores showing that students who spend more time on school computers tend to score lower, and scores started dropping around the time schools began distributing laptops. That's point one. Point two summarizes over 20,000 studies on EdTech tools and concludes they perform below the level of ordinary classroom instruction. And point three, he argues that screens are neurologically inconsistent with how learning works. They open up distraction, and they make learning frictionless in ways that feel helpful but aren't. Now, Barnum argues that correlation isn't causation, and Horvath acknowledges that. The meta-analysis methodology is disputed by researchers who are themselves skeptical of EdTech. And the frictionless learning argument, which I actually think is the most interesting part of Horvath's case, is more nuanced than his conclusion suggests. And that's where I want to spend most of the time in this episode. So let me start with the handwriting versus typing question, which is a point that Horvath makes, because I think it's the clearest example of what this whole debate gets wrong when it gets too broad. There's generally solid cognitive science showing that handwriting beats typing for encoding new information. For example, for taking notes from a lecture, for synthesizing ideas while reading. And the reason is almost counterintuitive. The handwriting is slower. You can't transcribe everything, so you're forced to process and select. And that friction, that extra cognitive work, is doing real work. It's more likely to move information into long-term memory. But here's what the research does not say. It does not say ban keyboards, because if you remove access to technology when students are writing essays, something different happens. You get shorter drafts and fewer revisions. The friction that helps you encode hurts you when you're trying to compose, develop, and refine. And those are different cognitive tasks. They require different tools. So the research is task-specific, not technology-specific. And the distinction matters a lot because a blanket screen ban treats both tasks the same way. It applies the same answer to two different questions. Knowing which kind of friction serves learning in a given moment, that's a pedagogical content knowledge question. It requires a teacher who understands both the task and the learner and the purpose. And the policy written in a state house or a district office can't make that call. So I want to be fair to Horvath and what he's reacting against, because some of his instincts are sound, even where the evidence may be contested. Larry Cuban documented this dynamic in a book called Oversold and Underused, published over 25 years ago, or 2001, which means we've been having this conversation for just that long. Cuban's argument was that schools absorb technology without changing the underlying instructional model. The technology gets, call it, domesticated. It becomes whatever the school was already doing, just on a screen. If your instruction was incoherent before the Chromebooks arrived, the Chromebooks will be incoherent. If your writing curriculum lacked rigor, the laptop is not going to add rigor to it. The EdTech industry has had a financial interest in overdiagnosing problems and overprescribing technology as the solution. It was true in 2001. It was true during the one-to-one laptop wave of the 2010s, which I saw firsthand working in schools during that period. And it's still true now. Just AI is a new layer on top. Horvath's instinct to name that conflict of interest is very legitimate. His argument is about accountability, that the burden of proof should fall on the vendors, not the critics. And I think that's reasonable. The problem is that his testimony has been used to justify blanket device bans that are far blunter than anything his evidence actually supports. We love bans. They sound decisive. They signal that someone has seen the problem clearly and acted without flinching. A screen ban tells a particular story about leadership. But a screen ban treats a question of instructional design as a question of discipline. And those are different problems that require different solutions. The sharpest version of this comes from thinking about students for whom technology isn't optional. Richard Culata has written about how technology decisions for students with learning differences are highly individualized determinations based on the specific needs of specific students. A blanket device ban doesn't just inconvenience those students. For some of them, it removes a tool that is genuinely necessary for access to learning. And that's where the debate stops becoming abstract and starts having real consequences for kids. It's a dimension that is almost entirely absent from the current public conversation. Now, none of this is an argument against phone bans. I want to be clear about that because I think that inflation of cell phones with Chromebooks and adaptive learning tools is exactly where some state legislatures are currently going wrong. In the last 5 years of conversations with educators, I've not encountered a single teacher asking for students to use their cell phones in class. Nobody says, take out your cell phone during class. It just doesn't happen. The consensus is close to uniform. Cell phones are a distraction, and there's well-documented evidence of their negative effects on adolescent attention and social and emotional development. I visited a district here in New Jersey last week that's in its second year of a school day ban of cell phones, and both staff and students couldn't be happier. An administrator in another school district that I visited earlier in the week said trying to handle the phone issue without the ban is nearly impossible. As she put it, quote, "You're dealing with addicts." Now, precision in policy matters. Banning phones is one thing. Banning the Chromebook a student with dyslexia uses for speech to text is another. And treating them as the same decision isn't toughness, it's imprecision. So there are different audiences here with different considerations. For teachers, the next time a device policy lands in your building, hold it up against your instructional design. Ask yourself, where does it help you and where does it tie your hands? Specifically, does it produce the right kind of friction? And does it enable you to make different decisions for different students on different tasks? If it doesn't, the feedback that you need to give your school and your district is that this policy isn't going to work for you. For instructional coaches, the handwriting versus typing distinction, I think, is genuinely useful as a discussion for professional learning because it's not really a debate. It's because it models the kind of task level thinking that should precede any technology decision. The question isn't screens or no screens, it's what is this task asking students to do cognitively and what does that require? For district leaders, Cuban's book is 25 years old, but it describes a pattern your district has almost certainly seen repeated. Before you adopt the next technology and before the next ban, ask whether you have a clear account of what learning is supposed to look like with or without the tool. And if you don't have that account, press pause on the policy. You have to think twice about reacting to the moment before you have that vision. So the question was never really screens or no screens, and that's the debate that I want to try to reframe here. It really should be, what does the learning require and who is qualified to make that decision? It won't surprise you to learn that I think educators are the people who are best positioned to answer this question. Not because they're infallible, but because they're closest to kids. They have the contextual knowledge that a policy simply cannot have. They understand the specific cognitive demands of a specific instructional task. The student who needs the device and the students who need to put it away, that's known to them, and that is self-evident from their teaching. Michael Horn, in the Education Week piece, offers advice to district leaders that I also think is sound. Don't lead with the technology. Start with what you are trying to accomplish for students. Design your model first, then ask what tools are going to serve that model. That's the reasonable framework, and it's the one that Cuban was calling for essentially 25 years ago when he observed that schools were doing just the opposite. So for technology to serve learning, the people closest to learning have to be the ones to make the call. And that means educators need the professional authority to make differentiated decisions. And policies need to be written with enough precision to enable that authority rather than override it. Horvath told the Senate that the burden of proof should fall on the purveyors of EdTech, not on the critics. I don't think he's entirely wrong. The vendors who have sold districts technology without evidence deserve a lot of scrutiny. But there's a question that his testimony didn't answer, and that is, what is the burden of proof for the ban? If we remove technology from a classroom without asking whether it was being used well or poorly, without asking what learning was happening around it, we haven't made a pedagogical decision, we've made a political one. And students, particularly the ones who have the least access to technology outside of school, who have the most to gain from tools that extend their learning, who are most likely to be in the districts where broad bans land hardest, those students deserve better than that. Thanks for joining. We'll see you next time.